contract, if you decide to go with Rose, would probably have to be with Claremont McKenna. Next, as to whether they met the administrative requirements, we found that, again, they met the requirements for the next 2 pages.
I'm sorry, Mrs. Johnston. Can I just go back?
Sure.
You were mentioning Secretary of State number K.
Right.
You were saying since the Rose Institute is not registered, they would have to go under Claremont McKenna. Is that correct?
I believe so. It doesn't appear that Rose Institute is a separate organization alone.
So if they have to go under Claremont McKenna, do we have to have information on Claremont McKenna, or? Okay, I
think it's up to you whether you decide that's a material. You do not have information about it. You have to decide whether that's a material difference.
Okay, thank you.
Page 7 of our checklist, we had no problems. Page 8 of our checklist, we said no to C on page 8, which was the information security. And that was because in their bid, they didn't explain what it was. They made a statement that they, remember where that was exactly? Right back here, I think. And so on page 9 of their bid, they check that they comply with security measures, but then in their description, I apologize. It is very hard to find.
It's page 22, which follows 14 and 21.
Yes, thank you. They say they have had extensive experience, and they have maintained the records of active judges without having that information compromised or for the Native American tribes in the casinos. But they did not provide they did not describe any of the security measures that they take. So they've said they provide security measures, but did not describe what they were.
I'm sorry. Can you tell us what page you're reading from in the bid, and not in your
page 22 of the bid? It's page 14, page 21, and then page 22. About a third of the way through the bid. Okay. 22. Oh, okay. Section C.
Two page 23s.
Oh, okay. I was looking at the other page 22.
And your comment here was?
Well, they did not demonstrate that they met business accepted industry standards. They just say they have had extensive experience in keeping sensitive material confidential.
And the scope was larger. And basically the scope of what we were asking in terms of data and IT security is much larger than keeping records confidential. And so we felt that we should make a note of that.
Yes, what it says, turning back to our analysis on page 8, must employ information security systems conversant with industry standards that will be maintained throughout the course of the conduct in critical areas such as, but not limited to, secure data transmission, data monitoring and verification, data storage and backup, and confidentiality practices.
Thank you.
On page 12, you may want to pull out page 12 because page 12 is sort of of the issues we found with the bid. So we'll go through those, and I'll refer you back to it as we get further along in the problems that we had. On the projects that they provided information about, They were deficient in some respects because they did not give a start or end date, so it was impossible to say that they were within the last 20 years or not. In addition, as to Arizona, it does have a diverse population, but it's a different diversity than that in California. And your bid requirement said that they had to be within 15% of the diversity in the enumerated cities. And Arizona did not fall within that for blacks or Asians. Again, it's up to you to consider the significance of that. San Diego did qualify, obviously. Turning to page 15 of our...
I have a question for clarification. So, no start, I'm looking at page 13, correct?
Mhm.
So, no start date or end date, is that for the Arizona
Or for San Diego.
or for San Diego? And when it says projects were completed by a different entity, what does that mean?
Oh, that is, we'll go to that later, but I can explain it now. When we talked to the references, it was pointed out that National Demographics Corporation, where Mr. Johnson worked, was the entity that actually contracted with Arizona and with the San Diego Unified School District. In his documents, he said that it's the same team that will be working on this project, but other than Mr. Johnson, we have no information as to what the carryover is. So we don't know why they had a different entity that was doing the projects, the other two projects.
So the Rose Institute was not the entity doing Arizona?
Correct. Or the San Diego School District.
Oh.
It was a National Demographics Corporation.
And is it the same people that will...
What he says in his description of them, it was Mr. Johnson and other Rose Institute team members working as National Demographics Corporation did this work.
But we don't know from the bid whether it's the same people that worked on that will be working...
We know that Mr. Johnson worked on both.
Okay.
That's the only person that's identified by name.
And
Okay.
actually, when we go and have a discussion about our conversation with the reference, we got a little bit more information.
That we'll be getting to.
Okay. All right. If you're going to get to that, I just...
As to the third project, Santa Clara Valley Water District, no phone number was provided, and we talked to General Services what we should do since they were required to be available by telephone within 24 or 48 hours. And I said, well, he's a city attorney, I can probably look him up on State Bar website, and she said, no, you're not allowed to do that. If the information is not provided in the bid, you have to disqualify them as a reference.
If I may, though, the bid asked for two examples.
And they gave us three.
Three were provided, so in losing that third one, we still had two to evaluate.
And may I ask a clarification? So in neither of these examples of projects do we actually have a contracted project on behalf of the Rose Institute or Claremont McKenna College?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Then getting back to the description of the contractor's role, the role is described in the bid material on page 24 and 25 for Arizona and San Diego.
Taking a while.
Has everyone found those pages in the bid? Based on the material provided there, we could not determine any of the answers to the questions that are asked about each of the projects. We did learn from the reference we called in Arizona that the entire state of Arizona is subject to Section 5, but nothing in the material provided in the bid proposal identifies consideration of either Section 2 or Section 5. So, then we get to the references. The first one was the chair of the Redistricting Commission.
I'm sorry, I wanted to step back just real quick. I had a question. Pursuant to the rules of the Department of General Services, are you not are not permitted to have a general understanding that Arizona, the entire state of Arizona, was a Section 5?
Yes.
Are you permitted to do that?
You are permitted to do that, but the questions asked were of the entity's involvement in dealing with those issues, and there was nothing in the description provided by the contractor as to any consideration of those issues.
And that's because there was a difference between the submission under the Rose Institute versus national demographics?
No, there simply is nothing provided. If you look at page 24 and 25.
Okay, continue on. We'll take this up when we determine whether this is a
Okay.
deviation. Thank you.
So then we started talking with the references, and Mr. Lin was very cooperative. He was off on a corporate retreat, but he managed to get back to us nonetheless. That was where we first, it had been mentioned in his description here that it was working as national demographics, but when we talked to Mr. Lin, he actually said, no, it wasn't Rose Institute, it was national demographics, which was the time we understood that there was a issue there. They did mention that Mr. Johnson was there. Adams, who, according to, as we understood, the submission was retired now. Leone, which we don't know if that's the same as Leone. I think from the testimony we heard from her yesterday, you can assume that it was the same as Leone. And McDonald. Lisa Hanley was listed on the project as a separate contractor, according to Mr. Lin. She's a...
Can you clarify who McDonald is in this circumstance?
No, it was the names he mentioned.
Okay.
They are not, he was not listed as a person in the Rose staff that were going to be included, he or she.
No, did he not mention Dr. Alan Heslop?
No, that was not a name we were given.
Okay, thank you.
As to the bidder's contribution to resolving issues, Mr. Lin said that NDC was able to produce the maps that they were directed to, and that the commission gave them the criteria that they wanted NDC to follow, and NDC was able to do that. As I mentioned, the bid did not talk about Section 2, but Mr. Lin said that because of their concerns, Lisa Hanley did conduct several analyses of voting and potential voting dilution, that were issues that were considered by the commission. So that's actually the next two questions that they, although the bid didn't mention it, we do understand that Ms. Hanley conducted that research.
So then why does it say no on the top of page 17?
Because the bid did not describe it.
Okay, I thought...
So the contact didn't verify the bidder's description. The contact gave us additional information.
Okay, thank you.
Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
And just to clarify, Ms. Hanley was a separate contract, was not employed by...
That was according to what Mr. Lin told us.
Okay, so not as a staff member of NDC.
Mr. Lin confirmed that the entire state of Arizona is under Section 5 pre-clearance requirements, and that the commission considered this a major factor.
But I think the question that Michelle's asking, that I have as well, is did the commission have a separate contract with Lisa Handley, or did NDC have a contract with Lisa Handley?
Again, we're restricted by what's either in the resume or what we were told, what's in the bid submission or what we were told by the references. According to the references, it was a separate contract. That might be something you could ask Mr. Johnson to clarify.
Okay, thank you.
Commissioner Young.
The name Lisa Handley also appear on page 5 of the review.
Yes.
The statement reads, Lisa Handley appears to be a subcontractor. How do you reach that conclusion?
Because in her resume, she is listed as an employee of, not of Rose Institute, but of Frontier International Electoral Consulting. And she's not listed as an employee of Rose Institute, as the other members of the team are. So since she's not, if she's not an employee, then the only way she could be working with them would be as a subcontractor.
If I may, we pose that as a question, not as a determination.
Right.
Just based on what we're seeing.
Thank you.
And then on the litigation issue, I think this was a question you asked before. We got more information from Mr. Lin about the problems that Arizona faced. First, they had the initial plans that they submitted. Again, this is according to Mr. Lin. The initial plans they submitted to Justice were rejected, and they had to be redrawn in order to get Justice's approval, pre-clearance approval. And then even after that, there was ongoing litigation, 2 separate lawsuits, as he recalled, 2 trials that lasted about 5 years before the issues were finally resolved. And finally, there was a 3-judge panel who appointed a special master who made the final decisions as to the map. As to his description of the bidder's comportment and dealing with the public and the commission, again, he said it was always NDC, but he was very complimentary about how they produced their work. They were very professional, did whatever the commission required, never interjected their own personal views, and they had very professional in their interactions with the public. And he did mention that they did a public participation kit as well. I don't think we put down, but
It's in the first response.
first response. So as far as the working relationships with the commission staff, and the public, there was only praise for national demographics. Then we spoke with Ricardo Soto, who was in-house counsel. He's now back working with the Department of Justice in the
EEO.
EEO.
Or city EEO.
In the education, wasn't it?
That's the Department of Ed.
Department of Ed. He confirmed that it was NDC contract. He said the principals were Mr. Douglas and Dr. Adams. This is when they talked about the public materials, educational materials, presentations to the public, and said that NDC was very good at identifying population groups of interest and facilitated the public input meetings. When we asked about the bidder's contributions to resolving the issues resulting from prospective lines, he said that they performed an analysis of the potential exposure on California Voting Rights Act. So, and he also recalled a vote dilution analysis. But when the next question asked whether the contract verified whether VRA analysis was done, we did not get that from the contract, from the bid. We got it from the reference. Always professional, always helpful, no complaints at all about the staff. So finally, as to the people that were proposed to be used for the project, the people and the descriptions given of their experience did satisfy all the requirements for knowledge and expertise in the stated areas.
One clarification, under the geography of California as related to redistricting, it does say no. Could you explain more?
I'm sorry, what page is that?
We're on page 22, under the knowledge and experience area.
Only because there was nothing as to California as a whole.
Okay.
And I don't know whether that is significant. They certainly had experience throughout in different parts of California, but nothing as to the whole state.
In other words, nothing in the narratives or in the resumes that clearly stated that that was an area of expertise.
Thank you.
Which would be the 2 places where we looked for in both bids for that.
As to the projects, their proposal for how they would staff your project, Mr. Johnson would be the project leader, and explained that he had been chief technical consultant to the Arizona Commission and assisted in redistricting a number of other public entities, a number of which were within California. Did not provide any information about litigation. Dr. Andrew Bush is the Rose Institute director, and the only description provided was management and strategic project, which we didn't know what that meant, but we put it down. Kenneth Miller is associate director of Rose Institute, and had the same responsibility. Dr. Florence Adams is listed as retired, and no description was given of what role she would play in the California plan. She did have extensive experience in redistricting throughout California, different public entities. Vipasa Nadon was assistant to the director. It was not clear that she had any experience in that area. Dr. Lisa Handley, she is the one who has experience as a VRA expert and in line drawing, but this is where we were not clear if she was being brought in as a contractor or as a staff person, because she's not listed as an employee of Rose Institute, and her role was not defined in the proposal. And we noted that the potential conflict that she had from her prior work. Justin Levitt, as we mentioned previously also, he was a fellow. The role that a fellow provides was not identified, and he did work for the Assembly Republican Caucus.
No, the analyzed bills.
Right, and a part of his job with the Assembly Republican Caucus was in analyzing bills and supporting the floor team. Then there, Jackson Sohi was identified only as a manager, no other description. David Mayer, again, he said he had mapping experience, and his title would be GIS Director. Ryan Boone, an associate, did not have a description of what role he would play. Chloe Cotton, an associate, and was, again, the role was not delineated, and she was one of the people we noted had worked for a Democratic senator. Nathan Folk is an associate. By the way, if you look at the resumes of these people, they're students, not surprisingly. Emmeline McNabb, again, an associate, no experience, no explanation of responsibilities. Aditya Pai, the same. Helen Pollock, the same. Samuel Stone, the same. And he was an intern with, Helen Pollock also was an intern for the Republican Assembly Office of Policy. Samuel Stone had previously been an intern with Senator Boxer. And Catherine Yao had no indication of her position beyond associate and no indication of her prior experience.
Thank you. At this time, it's my understanding that in order to determine whether or not this bid is responsive, at this point there are areas that have been identified by staff, and the question now becomes for the full commission whether or not there has been a material deviation such that this bid would not be deemed responsive. And counsel, correct me if I'm wrong, but your recommendation was that we would take each of the noted indications from staff of whether or not where there does not appear to be responsive, and we may make inquiry of the bidder to the extent we have further clarification that we may seek if there are circumstances where we deem it to be a material deviation.
I think that's substantially correct. You can ask for clarification, but not for additional information from the bidder.
So the process and procedure for this commission, as just for clarification and for members of the public, we will take each of the items that Ms. Johnston has highlighted where there may not have appeared to be responsiveness to the extent in which this commission determines there to be that such is a material deviation. We can seek further clarification. But there will need to be, as I understand it, a vote for each of these. But if we can concur that something that was identified as staff as not really a material deviation, we can just move forward without a necessary vote. So, for instance, let's begin with item number 1 regarding the original signatures. Again, we're on page 3 of attachment B of the evaluation.
Okay, I'm sorry, Madam Chair. Can I just ask for clarification? So we would be voting on whether we believe it's a deviation or whether we believe it's a deviation that makes them non-responsive for the whole bid.
Correct. This first one is a good example. Does the commission as a whole believe that the description of whether or not there was no original signature, no signature on the bidder declaration form constitutes a material deviation, or would we all agree that it could pass through without it being identified as a material deviation? In other words, if we're in agreement that an original signature is not that big of a deal and we can move forward and we don't need to vote on it. But if any commission member feels that additional discussion is necessary because something identified by staff would, in their opinion, constitute a material deviation, then we need to discuss it as a full commission and likely consider a vote as to whether or not the full commission deems it a material deviation. And that would not require a supermajority.
Correct.
So does everyone understand? Okay. Any further questions of staff? Commissioner Yao.
Just a point of clarification. So if we do find let's use it as an example, one item that we determine to be inadequate, and that would be sufficient to declare the whole proposal be non-responsive.
To the extent that there is any vote from this full commission by, I assume, a majority, not a supermajority, but a majority, that would constitute a material deviation. Once there's a finding, then it's deemed that they were not a responsive bidder, and they would then fail.
And, Madam Chair, the other issue with the bidder declaration, that's the one where if there is a subcontractor, the information is to be provided there, so you might want to seek clarification from Mr. Johnson on that issue.
Okay. Before we get to number one, I guess we're still we're working.
Number one.
It is. I guess before we got there, I just wanted to see if there was any other preliminary questions regarding the process as we go through each of the items that were identified by staff.
So again, the clarification is if we do find a single item, then that's sufficient to declare the entire proposal to be non-responsive.
Any issue in which there is a determination by this commission as a material deviation, and even if that's one, then that's true, is my understanding, that then the entire bid fails as non-responsive.
And if you think that it's not sufficient grounds to deny the contract, then you should vote that it's not material.
I understand that particular point, but one is a sufficient number to disqualify the entire proposal.
Correct.
Okay.
Any other questions or clarification regarding the process? Okay, let's move forward with number one, the original signatures. Oh, Commissioner Raya.
I have a question with respect to that. Sorry, I was going to start reading from the beginning of this.
I didn't want to do it unless we were going to ask for clarification. And then we'll have them.
It requires that it bears the original signature of a person authorized to bind the firm. And in my mind, there seems to be a question as to with whom we would be entering into a contract. So I guess I don't know if this would be an opportunity for clarification, but is Mr. Johnson authorized to bind on behalf of Claremont McKenna College?
If you're seeking clarification, the bidder is here, and we can invite him forward, which we might as well do so. Mr. Johnson?
Yes.
You can address the commission on this issue. Thank you.
Good afternoon. The Rose Institute is not a standalone entity, and that is why the bid is written as the Rose Institute at Claremont McKenna College. That is the entity name that the college lawyers gave us to use as the bidding entity. And the signatures are by people authorized to bind the college. And so it is the Rose Institute at Claremont McKenna College, but there is no Rose Institute bank account anywhere. It's a Claremont McKenna bank account. All the registrations are Claremont McKenna, but this is how the college has us describe ourselves.
May I ask a follow-up clarification? If you could explain to us, then my understanding would be that this document should be signed by someone from Claremont McKenna College or the Rose Institute. So if you could just talk about the lack of a signature on this page.
Oh, yes, of course. The page does not ask for a signature, first of all. At the bottom it says, by signing the bid response. And this page is called the bidder declaration. The entirety, as we read it, is the bid response. And so we signed the bid response.
Thank you.
There's no line for a signature on the page either.
Thank you. Any other questions on this item number one?
I would just comment that I think that's sufficiently ambiguous that I don't consider that to be material.
Okay. Does anyone else believe that this is a material deviation that would necessitate a motion in that regard, or may we just dispense with that and consider it responsive?
I'm not sure if this is number one or number two. Are we? Look, I'm assuming we're on page 12.
We're on page.
Well, 12 of the. I'm looking at the deviation worksheet in terms of as we're going through.
I think she's looking at number one on page 3 of our evaluation.
It's the same. It's summarized on page 12. I'm looking at it as chair, so I could have more detailed information to direct the commission. They're all listed in one box on page 12 for all of them together, but we're taking the same ones.
Okay.
One by one.
So I apologize if it's only going to the signature, but I guess it goes to the underlying nature of the signature, which is the question of the subcontracts. And if that's included, I would like clarification regarding that. If that's different, then we can wait until that comes up. But the question remains. But if it's out of order, I'll withdraw my query.
I have the same question, so I'm willing to wait, but I do want to know when we go back if there is a subcontractor where that person's signature is reflected.
Right.
Well, it's not that that person's signature is required, it's that the bidder declaration state that there is going to be a subcontractor. And on the bid declaration, which is not signed for perhaps a good reason, there's an indication there is no subcontractor.
Could I suggest that on page 5 or 5C, the bidder declaration form goes into more detail maybe about the subcontractor? Would it be acceptable to discuss the subcontractor there and just keep number 1 as simply the signature? Page 5C.
Commissioner Green? Commissioner Ward?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, in looking at this criteria that says no and listening to the explanation, how did staff interpret that differently? I was concerned about that too, given the understanding presented was of signing this paper was significant to me, and no response was significant. But after hearing that explanation, I'm wondering where staff interpreted that did need to be signed.
At the bottom of the page, it says, by signing the bid request, I certify under penalty of perjury that the information provided is true and correct. We had expected to find a signature there, but I cannot say that his explanation is not reasonable.
And clarification, it says bid response, it doesn't say bid request.
Yeah. But it says certification, which normally requires a signature, but it's
Also,
no big deal.
if I may, no, in addition to, if there is a subcontractor, it does need to be signed. If there isn't a subcontractor, there's no immediate need to sign it at that point. In other words, not having it signed is not the issue. The issue was not being able to tell whether Ms. Handley was a subcontractor or not. If she was a subcontractor, that would trigger the signing of that form and declaring that that person was a subcontractor. Because we couldn't resolve that issue on our own, we had to bring it to your attention.
So based on this, I would feel like it'd be important at this moment to ask for clarification regarding whether there were any subcontractors anticipated on this project.
Sure. And there's a lot of information in here, so no surprise that there are things that need clarification. If you look at page 7 of our proposal, and it's actually at the beginning, so it's before the numbers get haywire. Let me see, 1, 2, 3rd paragraph, it talks about Dr. Handley. Starting at the end of the 4th line, it says she provides guidance and strategic advice to the Rose Institute team. She and I are friends. We've worked on tons of projects together. Well, not tons. We've worked on a number of projects together. We're bidding on more now. But she's not a paid advisor. The next line is, should the commission be so inclined, the Rose Institute team highly recommends her as a separate consultant to the commission, providing racially polarized voting analysis. And then go on to talk about, we feel this analysis is very important to the commission's work, which is why we talked to her and got a proposal to kind of jumpstart this ahead. But
if I could explain our confusion on that, is that her resume is included under the staff section of the Rose Institute.
So based on your clarification, you're recommending that she could be hired by the commission as a separate consultant. But if that's the case, if she's not a part of the staff in this bid, therefore her experience couldn't be considered as meeting some of the requirements of staff.
Right. I wouldn't expect you to give us credit for her being a formal part of the team. I mean, she's essentially an informal advisor to us. And she's involved and we talk a lot, but no, she's not a paid member of the team.
And so no compensation would be paid from the Rose Institute to Ms. Handley as part of this bid?
Right.
Thank you.
Which, to clarify the other question, is also how it worked in Arizona. I think she was hired either by commission directly or by one of the lawyers.
So as such, then, you are certifying the basis for the lack of signatures, that there are no subcontractors, as the bid declaration page requires? So as such, you're contending you have adequately responded to this portion regarding signatures on the bid declaration.
Yes.
Thank you.
Can I ask Ms. John, I'm sorry.
I'm lining everybody up. We'll get certainly Commissioner DeGiulio, and then Commissioner Glamis-Malloy, and then Blanco.
Then if she's not to be considered in terms of meeting the qualifications of the bid, for staff on page 22, where it asks for the knowledge and experience area, was any of her material used to provide a yes for knowledge and or experience?
I believe so, yes.
So is there any area here that would go from a yes to a no if you took out Ms. Hanley?
We'll have to go back and take another look at that.
Okay.
We were assuming that she would be included.
Okay, thank you.
How much time would that take? Can you do that?
Do it during the next break.
Or, okay.
You want to do it now?
No, because we're not at that section yet. I'd like to we are jumping around a little bit, and there's a little overlap here. I suspect as we go along through the other items highlighted that there may not be so much overlap, but we can probably do it at a break before we get to that section.
Good.
Thank you. Commissioner Glamis-Malloy.
My question was whether there were any other staff involved in this project who brought VRA experience, or if we took out Ms. Hanley, if we were absent VRA experience.
Same question that staff needs to address. Thank you. Commissioner Blanco.
Similar, but precisely on, she's described as what she would provide to the team would be the racially polarized voting analysis, which is time-consuming, and that we recommend we hire her. My question to Mr. Johnson is, if we were not inclined to hire Ms. Handley, who would the Rose Institute team that's in the bid would do the racially polarized voting analysis?
Well, first of all, racially polarized voting analysis is outside the scope of this bid, which is why we didn't put her on our team.
Correct. That's right.
But certainly, we would work with whoever you wanted to. I personally have done quite a bit of racially polarized voting analysis as well. I do it for clients. She does it as a testifying expert, and there's a definite difference there. But that's the main reason.
Okay. Any other questions on item 1 on the original signatures? Seeing none. Is there any commission member that feels this is a material deviation for which they would like to recommend a motion in that regard? If not, then we'll move on. Thank you. Next item, page 3, the binder format. Is there any commission member that feels that what is documented by staff would constitute a material deviation for which they would like to make a motion? Wouldn't think so. Thank you. Page 5, subsection C, the bidder declaration form. Again, we had clarification on that. Does any commission member feel that they need to move forward with a motion that such constitutes a material deviation? Seeing none, we will consider that satisfied. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, could you clarify which one you're talking about?
C, the bidder declaration form. We overlapped a little bit with the last.
Oh, okay, sorry.
Does there need to be further clarification, Commissioner Anchetta? Okay. I understood that we'd already clarified that. So we're moving on to D on page 5 of the staff evaluation regarding conflict and impartiality statement. As indicated by staff, and for clarification of the public following along, the staff has identified the fact that the statement itself in the bid identifies the fact that there are no conflicts, but yet staff has identified some questions regarding the resumes that were attached, and Ms. Johnston went through those with the resume. Commissioner Anchetta.
Well, I believe also in the evaluation it says there are numbers where no conflicts are identified. And I'd refer to the bidders, at least what I have is page 31 of the bid. I'll wait till you get to that first. So page 31. Okay. So, second to last paragraph, donations or funding. Well, a number of paragraphs indicate that the Institute or the bidder such that there are no conflicts. I find somewhat problematic the failure to list, although as someone who works at a university, I understand the burdens involved, but there is no listing or even a partial listing of donors so that at least a conflict of interest check could be done. Again, I understand this is a big college which probably receives a lot of money, a lot of donations. I would think that they're certainly tracking all of those donations. There may be some difficulty separating out designated donations or funding that goes from the college's whatever general fund is used and how it's. I don't know the allocation, but to the extent that there's money going to the institute itself, and there's some indication of some other donors, but we don't have dollar figures, and I find this lack of information troubling.
Commissioner DiGiulio.
This one, I'm curious to hear the other commissioners' thoughts, but part of this, the conflicts that staff had gone through with us, with each individual person, I find it hard to determine the level of conflict in regards to the roles in this project. So in the absence of knowing what these individual staff members will be doing and their level of involvement, it's hard to go to the next step then and look at the conflicts in a critical light. So I'm really frustrated with not being able to put those two things together to review this a little bit further.
Commissioner Ward and Commissioner Forbes.
I was just going to see if we could ask Mr. Johnson for clarification on this matter, on this issue.
Commissioner Blanco.
I would object to that. I really think that we should look at what the bid is in front of us. We did not, and not be asking for explanations at this point. I want to consider what we have in front of us, what our staff is walking us through, and then we can compile a list, I think, at the end of questions. But I really don't think, I think it's, if we handle this like that, then we might as well not have this process if we're supplementing the information with questions. I mean, that's just my own view, that I would rather have us walk through the actual official state process for looking at this, and then we can, bank our questions. But I don't want to be assuming what's in the application because of supplementation.
There isn't any request for supplementation, as far as I know, and that would be impermissible at this point in time. So the issue comes up regarding whether there would be a clarification necessary based on the information submitted. So if any commission member has a particular question of the bidder, Mr. Johnson, who's available, for instance, you brought that up. If you think it's a problem but cannot be otherwise substantiated based on that, that's one thing. But if you have particular clarification, I would, as chair, recommend that we do it per item of potential deviation so that we can make a determination of whether such constitutes a material deviation for a necessity of a vote and not wait to the end. So if any commission member has a necessity for clarification, and Mr. Johnson's been through this process before, I suspect, that he understands he would not be supplementing anything. So it's a question of clarification. So I will go back and offer the floor back to Commissioner DiGiulio to the extent in which you want to clarify. The individuals are identified in the bid on page 7 and 8.
It's not, and this is I guess, this is a little bit of the issue of clarification versus supplementation, because if it's not offered in here, I don't know. It's not something I can clarify the role because the role hasn't been defined. So I'm
sorry, I read it differently. I see the roles identified on page 7 and 8. So
there's specific. I should say, there's specific job functions within this project.
Well, again, and this is the difficulty. I understood Ms. Handley's again, where I'm looking at particularly on the bid, page 7 and page 8, and for instance, David Meyer, he wasn't identified, I don't think, in this particular conflict or impartiality statement, but he will lead the Institute's proposed work to post online live interactive versions of all plans presented. So, I mean, I see it as these individuals and their involvement in the scope of work is contained on these pages. So I don't know what's missing.
I guess it's the individuals that were identified as those that have the potential conflict.
Okay, Justin Levite is identified on page 7.
Okay, and
he will play a central role in the coordination of work among the Institute's large team.
I know there's the other individuals, Cotton, Pollock, and Stone. I'm trying to see if those individuals, and maybe those are the students.
I believe they're the
students. So again, maybe if their role is very minimal, the conflict of interest can be taken into consideration in regards to that or not. I don't know. I just would like to know. You can't apply.
If you'd like to ask clarification
okay.
of the bidder, he's here.
But if the information is not listed in here, it's not clarification on the issue. It's providing information. So I guess I should just leave it as my understanding with some of these individuals, because they're not listed, their specific responsibilities are not listed here. It's an absence of that material for me to be able to review their conflict in light of their specific role within this project.
To aid the commission, Mr. Johnson, do you have any recommendations?
Well, at least as to Mr. Levitt, you have the description that's there in that paragraph on page 7, so you could consider him and his potential.
Commissioner Forbes had been waiting.
Yes, that's okay. I wanted this is the appropriate time to discuss my concern about the absence of the funding sources. It seems to me that one of our absolute lodestars has been transparency. And we hear much about how political activities are funded, but no one knows who's paying for them. And that's the trouble I have here. I don't think you can take a pass by saying, oh, it's too big, I can't give it to you. I mean, you could have given me the top 10 donors, the top 20 donors, and say, I'm not going to give you 100,000 donors, but here are the main donors. I mean, there's ways of approaching this that would have provided us with information that's not here. And I'm quite troubled by not knowing where the funding sources are. They may be completely innocent, but I can't go out and defend it. And so that's quite a concern for me.
Commissioner Ryan?
Following up on Commissioner DiGiulio's concern, I have the same problem with whether we're talking about supplementing or clarifying. And if you look at some of those descriptions on page 7 and 8, they describe the person. They do not say what the person will do. And in particular, Dr. Miller, Dr. Bush, I guess those two anyway. Those two do not have a description of a role.
Commissioner Galamas-Malloy.
I want to recognize that this segment of attachment 4 has various components to it, so I think commissioners have feedback on different portions of it. My feedback is around the donations or funding and around services for parties or for similar interests. It is problematic for me as a commissioner, and I would anticipate that it should be also for the public, that I feel like the Rose Institute essentially said this information is, difficult to compile and or irrelevant, and essentially made the commission's decision for us as to what information we should have in front of us to make the decision. It's underscored, my concern around this issue is also underscored because, as I understand it, there was an opportunity for bidders to actually make inquiries and clarifications of staff into different questions, what they meant, whether they were really necessary, and that we confirmed that, yes, the question was there for a reason, that, yes, it needed to be answered on behalf of the Rose Institute, and that the Rose Institute, even knowing that information, still decided not to provide us with that information. And to me, that is an area of major concern.
Let me see if I can help a bit with this. We were asked a question about, a follow-up question around what we were expecting with respect to disclosure. We responded believing that the bidder, if you will, was the Rose Institute. And with that in mind, said, just tell us who's donated to the Rose Institute. Now that the bid is received, we find or learn that we had perhaps the wrong perception about who the bidder was. Indeed, it's the college rather than the institute, and hence the response that we provided.
And, you know, in following up, my observation is we don't have lists by either to the Rose Institute and or Claremont McKenna College. So it wasn't as though a decision was made, we'll provide this or that. It's the decision was made, we're not going to provide any of that information.
Commissioner Aguirre.
Yes, I would. I share that same concern, given that I would presume that most of the contributions that are made to this public educational agency are tax deductible, and in that sense, then, is required by law to maintain that list and the amount of the contribution for tax deduction purposes to those agencies. And in fact, the agency is supposed to. Is required to send a letter indicating the amount of that contribution, the date of that contribution, and sometimes for what purposes those funds are going to be used. So I think that information is readily available. Is for an institution like Claremont McKenna, I would say that they probably have a database that would require no more than querying the system or going to an Excel spreadsheet and asking for that listing with the amounts that would have been made available to us, which would have helped us out a lot.
Commissioner Yao.
This question is for Mr. Miller. With the misunderstanding as to whether we're asking for information from the Rose Institute versus asking for information from the Claremont McKenna College, how should we deal with that particular issue? Money that goes to a college, and having lived in Claremont for 50 years, I do know private colleges depend very heavily on donations to operate. And Claremont McKenna College had been around for a number of years, so they're reasonably successful in doing that. Is that the information that we would have asked for, or is it the information for money that goes directly to the Rose Institute, who are going to be doing the work? I guess I need to. It certainly is true that there's absolutely no information on the Claremont McKenna College here, but is that what we were expecting or asking for? Is that? I guess I'm having a little problem in terms of what is relevant and what information did we ask for.
Well, I think you have to frame first of all, who we thought we were working with as it relates to the question of funding. Now, it was our sense that the Rose Institute was an independent entity, if you will, within the college, and that it would have been eligible to receive donations directly. And we had in mind that model when trying to clarify the issue. Had we received a question that says something like, the Rose Institute is part and parcel of the university, receives no separate funding, and you will be contracting with Claremont University rather than the Rose Institute in the event we're awarded this bid, we might have responded differently. That wasn't the question we were answered, so we did our best to respond with the understanding we had at the time. And I can't speculate as to how it might have come out had a question been asked to us differently.
Commissioner Dye.
I believe the way the question was asked was, has the person or entity, and the entity we are now assuming it's Claremont McKenna College, submitting this bid during the past 10 years received donations or funding from any source, whether in cash or in kind, that are used to support the operations of the person or entity? If yes, please state the date, nature, amount of donation or funding, and the source of the funding. So I think the answer is yes, we would need all that information. I personally understand that large universities have many centers and institutes that are usually not independent. The issue I have is just the blanket statement that none of these funding sources represent any conflict, and yet there's no listing of them. So we have to kind of take it on faith that we don't need to know who they are, but they don't represent any conflict. So that's my concern. And then I know we're focused on the funding, but I still can't get over the first part, which was a response to listed conflicts. And it says that full disclosure is required here. And these are the same conflicts that were applied to the Commission. And the statement in the response to that is, neither the Institute itself nor any members of the Rose Institute team have any of the listed conflicts within the past 10 years. And I believe that's what Mr. Villanueva and Ms. Johnson had pointed out. There are members of the team listed that have exactly those conflicts. So you can argue whether you think it matters for a student or not, but certainly for Mr. Levitt, it's a clear conflict, and it wasn't disclosed. So that's something I have a problem with.
Commissioner Forbes.
Yeah, I want to read out of their bid. And I understand the problem of having many contributors for a university, but that's not the only funding sources. It says the Institute's operations are funded from the Institute's share of the college endowment. That's fine. Let's take that off the table. By contracted research projects, primarily, which means not exclusively, primarily for local governments, which ones, and to a small extent, how small, by donations from the Institute's Board of Governors, who are alumni and other small individual or organizational, which donors. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff outside of the college contribution list that I think should have been provided. I mean, and they don't offer any statement about that at all.
Commissioner Yao.
One phrase that caught my attention was that supports the operation. Commissioner Dye, maybe you can repeat that. That statement. I couldn't readily get to it.
Sure. Funding from any source, whether in cash or in kind, that are used to support the operations of the person.
Let me stop at that point. Is it appropriate for me to ask the question as to whether it does or does not support the operation of the Rose Institute?
If you're asking for clarification.
Yes. I think it's a clarification question, but I'll leave it up to the chair to interpret it.
I have the same clarification, so I'd like the bidder to respond.
If you turn to the Rose Institute informational page materials that are included in our proposal, they're after page 34. You will see a listing of over 50 of our recent projects. There's different sections depending on the type of project. Each one highlights our biggest projects in that field and then has a listing of other significant projects in that field. Altogether, over 50 of our projects are listed here, and they are our biggest ones. If you continue through that, past the list of projects, you get to conferences, and you see the conferences that involve, all of which were funding for us, our staff, and then the Rose Institute Board of Governors. So we do provide as much information as we are allowed to. And I would note, too, as we mentioned in the report, our donors and our activities are monitored by the IRS. We are not allowed to engage in advocacy under IRS law, and this is all mentioned in the report. So while we're unable to provide a list of all the donors to Claremont McKenna College for the last 10 years, because there are, like I said, thousands and thousands of them. I did provide our 50 largest projects, our Board of Governors, and you can only imagine how many weeks of dealing with lawyers it would take in order to get even a request for that list. And the same IRS laws that require us to disclose all that activity also limit the release of that information, just as it does for any nonprofit organization. And those laws go way back, and it would take months to sort through those laws to get you a full donor list.
Commissioner DiGiulio.
So are the items that Mr. Johnson pointed out, and this is a question for staff, are the items that Mr. Johnson pointed out, is that sufficient to answer that question, or is that still not a monetary, are we looking for the actual specific, I understand these are projects, we still don't know where the funding or how much they were, so does that meet the requirement, or is it not in your opinion?
This may have to go to the second part of your inquiry about how much public trust and sense of responsibility there is. In the first part, you're limited to the document itself. And from the document itself, he says no conflicts in staff, no conflicts in donations. There is nothing in the proposal that indicates any conflicts with donations. We just don't know. So I think his statement that there are none cannot be deemed non-responsive because he made a response that we have to accept just if there's no contrary information at this point in time. His statement that there's no conflicts among staff, I think you can look at the resumes to see whether there is an inconsistency there that's significant.
And I'm happy to clarify that whenever you want.
Mr. Miller?
Maybe I can ask one clarifying question. Does the Rose Institute receive from time to time donations directly to support its purposes? For example, if you have someone that is interested in this area, are they able to either give directly to the Rose Institute or give to the college and earmark those funds for the support of the Rose Institute?
Yes, we do essentially contract-type projects, and that's the projects that are listed in this Rose Institute publication.
Okay.
But they are checks to the college. They're not checks to the Rose Institute.
In addition, might one give a donation simply because they want to support the research function of the Institute?
Well, it sounds like an easy question, but as anyone that's been in a college knows, the money goes into a big pool. How they get sorted out is
my question is this. Let's say I have an interest in redistricting and want to support research in that area. I don't want it to go to bioscience. I want it to go strictly to redistricting. Can I give a check to the college for that purpose and ask them to earmark it to the Rose Institute for that reason?
It would be earmarked for a specific project, like those listed in the book here, if they wanted to go to a specific project. But that would be the person contracting with us for the project.
I have an additional question and clarification. Mr. Johnson, you pointed us, in addition to the list of the projects, you pointed us to the Board of Governors listing in here. So if you could clarify what your intent was in pointing us to this direction in response to questions regarding funding. Are we to interpret it as your Board of Governors are also donating to and funding the operations of the Rose Institute, and therefore we should also look at potential conflicts of the list of names and entities that are listed on the Board of Governors?
Yes, on the page 31, donations or funding text that we've been focused on, where it mentions the list of donors, we do include by donations from the Institute's Board of Governors. And Commissioner Forbes raised a concern that in this giant pack of paper he hadn't noticed that one page, so I wanted to point that page out to him because it is referenced on page 31 and provided on this, provided here in the packet.
So that's a yes, that your Board of Governors should be considered funders and donors of your work, of the Rose Institute?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
But we haven't had We haven't had staff look at them in terms of any conflict.
We haven't looked outside of what was provided to us.
This is, as we discussed earlier, this is the issue that staff clarified earlier. They took the statements of both of us. They didn't go into it, and this is exactly the question where we said we don't know, and Q2 answered wrong.
Commissioner Ryan.
I'm sorry, I don't think I quite understood the question that Mr. Miller, the question and the response. I want to be sure I got it right. I understood the question to be whether people can give money to the college to be earmarked for the Rose Institute, and I understood the answer to be yes, people who enter into contracts for a project. But I was hearing the question as just a donor. If I wanted to give you $1 million, could I just say, here's $1 million because I'm so interested in the work you do? Or give it to the college earmarked for you?
You would give it to the college, yes.
And that would be a donation. I'm not entering into a contract with you. I just want to give you money.
Sure.
That could be done. And is that done on a frequent basis?
I don't know.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments on item D?
So just a question on, so staff, Ms. Johnston, you're suggesting that that there is no material deviation, at least with respect to donations or funding, because the response is we don't see any, period.
We did not see any within the proposal, that's correct. Okay. We could see them as to the staff members, but not as to funding, because the information wasn't provided.
But is it able to provide information, material deviation? You're saying it's not.
Actually, if I could clarify, what we weren't pointing out a determination, right? That's up to the commission. What we were doing is pointing out areas where we asked for information, we, the commission, yourselves, the bid, and there was insufficient follow-through, or we couldn't find the information. As far as do they meet the requirement, that's not for us to say. That's for the commission to say.
So that was my further clarification, which is we asked whether or not there were conflicts of interest, and the response from the bidder is none of these funding sources represent any conflict with the Institute's proposed work for the commission. And that's the response.
And that there are no conflicts with staff.
And no conflicts with staff. Okay, so then if we wanted to take it to the next level in regard to the individuals that you've identified in B, we can discuss if any commission member has any concerns regarding what has been identified by staff, by our staff, as to the individuals that are identified on page 5. Commissioner Blanco.
I just want to make sure I know what we're considering here. There are two aspects to Section D, the conflict and the impartiality statement. One is the staff's statement to us in their review that this section is incomplete, and are you saying it's incomplete on two different bases? One, that there was a request for conflict information, and we don't have it for all of the people listed in as people working on the project.
No, that's what my that was my question.
That's why I'm trying to clarify.
Okay.
And then there's and then there's a separate issue as to the funding disclosures. I'm just saying, there's a conflict of interest issue and there's a funding disclosure issue. Is that correct?
Right.
Both under the same section?
Yes.
Right.
The
only
disparity we pointed out was as staff, because there's nothing within the bid submission that talks about outside funding sources other than Mr. Johnson's statement that there's no conflict. So we had nothing to contradict that with.
And there's a likelihood that that came about based on the inquiry and clarification that we provided to the Rose Institute.
Correct.
I want that on the record. Commissioner Bravo.
Yes, I was just looking at the Claremont McKenna College Rose Institute, and it says, if you want to make a contribution to the Rose Institute, outstanding programs with a gift, click to this link. Otherwise, please mail your gift to Stephen Siegel, Assistant Vice President, Institute and Advancement Operations. So apparently you can make a contribution directly to the Institute.
Yes, and that's what I told Commissioner Wright.
Yeah, okay. And it's very public that you can. In fact, it's encouraged.
Well, it's, as we discussed earlier, it's a donation to the college that is
This one
earmarked.
says the Rose Institute.
Commissioner, with all due respect, there is no Rose Institute bank account. It's similar to, the bank accepts checks into the Claremont McKenna bank account that have Rose Institute written on them. Internally, the college does keep track of such donations, obviously, but it's consistent with my earlier answer.
Commissioner Dye.
I'd like to give Mr. Johnson an opportunity to respond to the staff conflicts.
Thank you. It's a good question, and outside of the rush of putting this together, I realized the resumes could have been clearer. Dr. Hanley's conflicts are clear, but she's kind of a side issue. With Mr. Levitt, Ms. Cotton, Ms. Pollock, and Mr. Stone, all of those were fellowships or internships, essentially student programs. Mr. Levitt's was the Assembly Fellows Program. That's what he was doing at the time. So as those are all nonpartisan programs, I realize now going back to the resume, obviously I would come to the same thought it was, because some of them didn't clarify that it was a fellowship or an internship. All of them, however, Mr. Levitt's job is described. The others' jobs are not described because their job is to do whatever we tell them. And so if you want to exclude them from the project, my view was they'd be valuable members of the team. We put them in there for those roles, and those were nonpartisan programs, even though they put them into partisan offices. If the commission would be more comfortable excluding them, as I said, most of them are just do what we tell them type of staff roles, and you can do that.
So I don't have an issue with the student internships. My question is about Mr. Levitt, because on his resume it's listed that he worked for the Republican Assembly Caucus Office of Policy. Could you clarify more on how that's nonpartisan?
It was the Assembly Fellows Program, and he was assigned to that office. So I didn't view it as disqualifying, but I could see where people had raised concerns, and if you want to, we can exclude him from the project, certainly.
Commissioner DiGiulio.
I just wanted to, sorry, because I'm not as familiar with the Assembly Fellow Program, if we as commissioners had that in our background, would that have disqualified us?
I think we should ask Mr. Miller that question.
We can look back.
Well, I think in the absence of understanding how the program works, it's difficult to respond. It's not a program I'm familiar with.
I know a little bit about, and very little because I've written recommendations for students who are applying. It is nonpartisan in terms of its screening and acceptance and the application process to get a fellowship. My understanding that the fellow, and there's a Senate fellowship and an executive fellowship. I believe probably with I think maybe with some negotiation with the applicant, but I'm not sure about that. But that fellowship program will place you with somebody in the Assembly. And, of course, just about everyone in the Assembly has a partisan affiliation. But I think, I don't know if you can say, well, I only want a Republican or I only want a Democrat. But ultimately, you will work for a member of the Assembly who will have a partisan affiliation. And that's part of the fellowship program.
And I may be able to answer your question, too. I think in your qualifications, if you worked for the legislature at all, you're disqualified.
Yeah,
so
I was going to read
even
that.
if you were under the fellows.
It specifically says that you cannot have served as a paid congressional, legislative, or Board of Equalization staff, and I think this would be considered legislative staff.
The only thing is that it's run through Cal State Sacramento, so there may be some gray there, but if the gray makes you uncomfortable, I understand that.
For this purpose, perhaps the best test is, should it have been disclosed as opposed to whether it would be disqualifying?
Any other comments, questions, or concerns on the?
Question for staff. So this one, you know how before we were saying, is it omission, correction? What would we be looking at here on this one?
I think it is a deviation.
Deviation.
The question is whether you think it's material.
Right. So it's a deviation, not an omission. Okay.
We saw it kind of the way that the attorney's describing, in that should it have been disclosed?
Well,
And rather than making that determination ourselves, the question asked, is it there? We saw that information and felt you needed to see that. And so that does become one of the issues then. Is disclosure required?
Commissioner Ward?
I don't know. I shared the same concerns. I mean, the discussions, very fair, and this was very troubling to me too. But with the clarifications, I mean, this doesn't seem to be a problem. What are we trying to do? We're trying to give ourselves options here. I mean, that's why we put the bid out. Are we trying to find reasons to disqualify, or are we trying to provide ourselves, options at how to best, provide this service, and when we look at, the omissions and the things like that, I mean, when it comes to the financials, again, I don't think any of this wasn't disclosed. I was concerned that it was, but when we're talking about disclosing, we bring in the fellowships and the things like that, obviously it was disclosed because we found it in the resumes. I mean, it's there. I would have feel very differently if we had information of those and it wasn't there. Then I would, and such. But certainly it's there. And in his explanation of the financials, like Stan read, literally thousands of donations totaling millions of dollars every year. Again, I don't think in and of itself that's helpful. But providing a full list of donors over the last 10 years would take much longer than the time provided to complete this proposal, would require review by the college's legal and development offices. Understanding that and the timelines with this, and then with the clarification understanding that these things are tracked by the IRS and things like that, in and of itself, for this purpose, it doesn't concern me. Now later, when we get talking about transparency and things like that, that might be a factor. But with what we're discussing now, it seems like we're really beating it in a way that it doesn't seem like it's appropriate for this stage. So anyway, I'm comfortable with the information that's provided.
Thank you, Commissioner Ward. I do have just one point of clarification. Mr. Johnson, then I'll get to Commissioner Raya and Commissioner Brava. Making sure that I understand it correctly, on page 23, under the conflict and impartiality statement, you had specifically stated no conflicts. And now, based on the evaluation that has been provided by staff, make sure I understand you correctly, you did not feel that Justin Levitt and his identification as being a fellow with the Republican Assembly constituted a conflict that you needed to disclose on attachment 4, or was that an oversight?
No, I knew he had been an Assembly fellow, but I didn't view that as a conflict.
Okay, so you didn't see that he fit into any of these categories based on the inquiry that even the commission members have made about fellowships, because I truly don't understand that. So I just want that clarification first.
Right.
Okay. And so as to Handley, we've taken her out of the picture. As to Cotton, again, is it your explanation that you identified her as not having a conflict because it was an internship?
Yes, I think she was actually in high school at the time.
Okay. And Pollock, based on what staff has provided, again, your explanation is that that didn't constitute a conflict for our attachment 4 because, again, that was an internship?
Right. She actually lives in Sacramento, and she actually is a declined state voter. She was just doing an internship.
Okay. And Stone, I'm afraid my notes don't reflect what staff had identified for that. Can you provide the explanation as to why you thought there was not a conflict that you needed to identify on attachment 4?
Right. He was the one who did an internship in Senator Boxer's constituent service office in his hometown.
Okay. So just so that I have it, so you're providing clarification as to your explanation for your statement of no conflicts on attachment 4 based on the information and clarification I just sought, correct?
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Raya?
I just had a process question because we seemed to be, Commissioner Ward seemed to be stepping into into more of a discussion rather than questions or, some entry into deliberation. So I just want to understand exactly where we are in terms of this process.
I recognize that, and I did not cut him off, so to speak, primarily because of the fact that this is a new process and procedure.
Okay, that's fine.
You're correct that he probably did overstep a little bit, but Commissioner Ward, I want to just provide a further explanation that we are taking this step by step. We have to linger on these issues and seek the bidder's clarification where we think is necessary. So obviously everybody else had an opportunity to speak, and that's why I provided him a little leeway there. Does anyone else have any questions, concerns? I'd like to consider a break here. We have been going for nearly an hour and a half as well. But Commissioner Brava.
In the process, so let's say there's a bunch of little things, and you say, well, okay, but when do we step back and say, did those little things add up to something bigger?
Question becomes, as I had asked before, what the next step, and part of this discussion is whether or not somebody will provide a motion that whether this constitutes a material deviation. That's the process and procedures.
Item, we could say overall.
No, we're on Section D of the evaluation.
But that's not my question is,
okay.
So let's say we think this is not that big a deal. But if you go through this and you do 8 of them and you say, kind of not too big a deal, but there's 8 of them.
Move up.
Yeah,
But there's 8 of them. And I think there's 8 of them. I think that is a big deal.
8 of what?
8 minor little problems.
You mean like we started with the original signature?
Yeah.
Okay. We're not grouping them up. I mean, as I understand the process, and staff can clarify, we need to take them one by one.
But I guess my question is if you think about when we eventually go, if we have to go in front of a court, and we have to go through all these things to defend the action that we've taken because of how everything was run, it would seem to me that it's some of these that we need to make a judgment on as well.
I would, if I might suggest, you might do that in the second part of whether or not someone is responsible and has public trust.
Thank you. That answers my question.
Right. Correct. Thank you. Anything pressing before we consider a break? I'd like to make we'll take a 10-minute break and come back here at how about 5 of? Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming back from our break. We are resuming our discussion. All commission members are present from this morning. At the prior to our brief break, we were discussing the evaluation of the Rose Institute, and we were at Section D on the conflicts and impartiality statement. We have had a full discussion in that regard. Is there any other final comments that any commission member would like to make concerning this topic? Or any further clarification of the bidder, Mr. Johnson, who's present? Again, we're on the conflict and impartiality statement. Commissioner Galamas-Malloy.
So this, again, is in regards to the conflict and impartiality statement. And, as a commissioner, if there had been any sort of good faith attempt to provide us with even a partial listing of either donors to the Rose Institute, donors to Claremont and McKenna College, potentially donors over a certain size so as to make it a manageable number of donors, I think I'd feel differently. But absent of any real substance to validate the statement that says none of these funding sources represent any conflict with the Institute's proposed work for the Commission, I do need to make a motion, and with that motion to identify the conflict and impartiality statement as constituting a material deviation from the requirements that we set forth.
Is there a second?
I'll second that.
The reason I'm momentarily, Ms. Sargis is not here to actually have written down the motion. So Ms. Johnson got it. Okay, good.
The motion is that the conflict, the state determination.
Any discussion from any commission member regarding the motion?
Yeah, just a process clarification. So we're kind of considering each of these one at a time to consider their material deviation, and then we'll discuss as a whole whether we consider the bid to be responsive? Is that
No.
correct?
If there is a majority vote, as I understand it, and staff, please correct me if I'm wrong, if the motion carries that this portion of the bid constitutes a material deviation, then the entire bid is considered non-responsive, and the result is a fail, and this bidder does not go forward any further, and we need not consider any other discussion item throughout the course of what has been identified by our staff. Am I correct, Ms. Johnston?
It depends on how you define material. If you say material means it's totally disqualifying, then yes. If you say it's material, but we want to see what else there is to consider at the end, I think that would be proper also. It really is up to the commission.
And in terms, so then does that fall to the maker of the motion to define what their intent is, or?
That would probably make it clear. If you think it's sufficiently material that it should disqualify from further consideration.
My motion is to acknowledge it as a material deviation, but to continue on, I would like to evaluate all of the sections and then be able to identify as a whole whether the bid is responsive or not.
And your motion is then amended? Or there was a motion previous?
I'll accept the modification.
Okay, thank you. I forgot who seconded it.
The response to the conflict and impartiality statement constitutes a material deviation, but we will continue to evaluate Rose Institute.
Yes.
And confirmation that Mr. Forbes is that you're agreeable to that addition? Okay. Okay. Let me put everybody in order. Commissioner Anchetta.
Yeah. So speaking to the motion, I also am, as I've stated earlier, troubled by the non-disclosure of potential conflicts. Again, there may not be any, but I don't know. Now, I understand there may be some ambiguity in terms of the staff's communicating to the bidder that perhaps the wrong or one entity or the Rose Institute as an entity might be the appropriate entity rather than the college as a whole, and I understand that may have created some ambiguity. Notwithstanding that, I still believe that even if the bidder were assuming that it were just the Rose Institute and therefore only a limited number of potential donors, that the bidder's reply is still non-responsive. Because even if you are a unit of a college and the college ultimately is the fiscal agent and is the ultimate contractor for whatever you're doing, universities and colleges track and have offices that track the flow of funds to that unit, the specific subunit of the college or university. So, again, presumably there is a dollar figure from which the Rose Institute's budget derives a portion of its funding from the college endowment directly. I don't know how much that is. It may be a lot, it may be very little. There are contracted research projects. Again, Claremont McKenna may itself be the entity that's signing those contracts. Again, we may have some indication of who they are. We don't know how big they are, what they're for. Again, various listings of donations. And again, it may be possible that some of these are designated specifically for the Rose Institute. I'm sure, as at many universities, you write a check to any number of units within the university. It still gets deposited to the big account. But somebody's tracking that, because it's not all just sort of goes into the pool and then gets lost. So you are responsible, I would think, for maintaining some sense of where the money's flowing, and that I would presume that the Rose Institute, if it gets a check, for example, that's made out to the Rose Institute, would like to see that money come back at some point, that it's not just sort of given to the university and it's never seen again, that there's some relationship between what the donor intended the money to be used for, and that it ultimately gets back to the, which I think, as it should, come back to the entity. I don't see that, and again, with respect to alumni, other individual organizational donors, again, it may be made out to Claremont McKenna, but I would presume there are some tracking mechanisms. I would think this is a well-established, very good college, that they have data on these. And even if one were assuming it were just the Rose Institute, there would be some more specifics regarding where those monies came from, how much they were, and all those items. And I didn't think that this provided sufficient information for us to make a decision. Again, there may be no conflicts whatsoever, but I just don't have enough given this information.
Commissioner Yao?
I'm puzzled. I thought one finding is going to disqualify the proposal, and here we are. If a positive vote on the motion before us, is it a conditional pass or what is it? I didn't think we were using the process of adding up all the negative scores from a number of things, and toward the end be able to make a decision saying that, okay, maybe every one of them is a pass, but overall we failed the responsiveness portion of the proposal. I guess I need to understand as to what the judging system is. I'm not questioning the
problem is it's very subjective. What is important enough to you? Is it important enough to raise questions in your mind, but you still want to go further, or is it important enough to you that you want to stop the process here? And as I understand Commissioner Galambos-Malloy's motion, it's sufficient to raise questions in her mind, but she still wants to look at the rest of the bid.
Again, may I continue?
Yes.
If the decision is saying that this is relatively unimportant, and even if it fails, we can go on, then I'd like to make that clarification up front. Okay, but if we say that it is important and we fail it, then I don't understand as to why we would go on and looking at the rest of it is really, I'm asking a process question. Early on I asked the question, would one failure disqualify the proposal? And the answer I got at that point was yes.
It could. I don't mean to be evasive about it, but you could decide that this is important enough to you that you should stop the process here. You could also decide that it's important, but you want to wait and see the rest of the information.
It's a process question.
So I made the motion based on my reading of the bid that we have in front of us. If there is another commissioner that would like to amend my motion or have an alternate motion that goes that next step, that can be done, correct?
Correct.
Let me ask a question of Ms. Johnson.
Commissioner Forbes and Commissioner Ryan.
I'm sorry.
Actually, DiGiulio beat all of you. So let me give her.
I'll wait my turn.
Okay, Commissioner DiGiulio.
Maybe we all have some of the similar questions here. I understand, I appreciate the explanation is that we have this leeway, and based on what Commissioner Galambos-Malloy has chosen, is she's chosen to frame her motion that gives us the opportunity to continue, and you're saying that's permissible, to frame it that way. My other question as an extension of that is, do we also have that permission, if at the end of the conclusion of all this, after we have gone through, would one of us as the commissioners be able to make a motion as to the proposal, taking all those things in consideration? Is that also permissible?
Yes.
Commissioner Forbes.
You don't need to call on me.
Commissioner Ryan.
Okay. I had the same understanding that Commissioner Yao did, that a material deviation without qualification, a material deviation is the end of the game. And my preference would be, if we're going to continue, let's just continue. I would ask Commissioner Galambos-Malloy to consider withdrawing her motion and continue, and then see where we are at the end, because clearly people still have questions. But if that's not her choice to do so, then I will not vote for the motion if all we're going to do is move forward.
Let me chime in. I haven't done that just yet myself either. I will take that prerogative. In looking at the bid evaluation guide, I concur with Commissioner Raya and Commissioner Yao that it was my understanding. It says a responsive bid is that which indicates compliance without, quote, material deviation. So given the fact that this motion contains the term material deviation, I feel that if this motion were to pass, then we already are finding there has been a material deviation. So if there's been a material deviation based on this finding as the motion is phrased, then it's suggestive that this does not constitute a responsive bid and there would not be a necessity to go further. Now, obviously, we've heard from staff more expert in this process than I, but if I suspect Commissioner Raya is correct, maybe if there was a withdrawal, if you really wanted to go through, which we have the discretion to go through the rest of the bid, then it may be worthy to consider withdrawal, or if you think it's a deviation, that might be another means by which you could consider that you want to mark the record that this constitutes a deviation but may not be necessarily a material deviation. I just the way that I evaluate it is once this motion, if it were deemed passed, you already have made the finding that this is a material deviation. That's just how I see it. Commissioner Blanco.
Well, I'm going to take the staff's interpretation, which is we have the discretion to decide whether it's sufficiently material to warrant a failed score or whether it's a material deviation that doesn't warrant a failed score. I think it is important, if we do think it's a material deviation, to my sense is that it's important to vote on that for the record, because we will, even if at the end we go through all the items and we end up one way or another, it will be important to be able to go back and see which were the items that we rated one way or another in order to come up with our final decision on the issue of responsiveness. So I think that it is important at every step to note what the Commission thinks is responsive or not responsive item by item.
I'll just go with who I saw first. Commissioner Ward, then Commissioner Aguirre, and Commissioner Yao.
I agree with Jean. I don't see the point of marking it and then just moving on. We should just take it, voting on each thing if the vote just moves us forward to consider all in the sum total anyway. And then isn't that a different standard than we applied to Q2? Because I believe they would have then had the option of having a material issue as well that from what we voted at the time, we would have probably voted was not a problem, but still a material deficiency. And we didn't, at least as I understand, have that option at that time.
I'm sorry, there was no finding by staff.
There wasn't a finding of it, but wasn't there an omission? Deviation, a deviation? Isn't that what we're...
There was no motion that was admitted that it was a material deviation. It was noted that there was a deviation. My motion is to recognize that this constitutes a material deviation.
Commissioner Aguirre.
Yes, I think that that really goes against what I understood, that has already been stated, that once you have a material deviation, then the process stops, and then you're done. The alternative to that is a system I use just to keep myself organized, where I ranked all the potential material deviations from 0 to 3, 3 being the most significant, and this ranked as very significant. So for me, once in my view, we got to one of the deviations and it was moved, and there was a majority of the Commission that voted for that motion as a deviation, that as Ms. Raya said, the game would stop. So I'm kind of troubled that we seem to be changing the process that seemed to have been clarified earlier when Chairman Yao asked very pointedly, if we get to one majority vote in favor of a deviation, an identified deviation, then that was it. Then that's what I understood. I think that's what the commission understood. So I would ask that we hold to that.
Commissioner Yao.
Again, as a matter of process, we spent a couple hours yesterday going over this bid evaluation guide, and that was, even though we didn't take a vote, that was acknowledged to be the process. And I know this commission has the latitude of changing the rules because we make the rules. But if we do so, we need to basically negate the understanding that we had that we were to follow this bid evaluation guide. If we're not going to follow it, or if we somehow interpret it differently, and I did not have that interpretation when we finished discussion this topic yesterday. May I finish?
Sure. I'm sorry.
So I don't. If this commission wants to deviate from this, I think we can take a vote and do so. But I think deviating from it without voting on it, I think is problematic in terms of a clarity of the process.
Ms. Johnston.
I think the confusion comes because it's the guide state, if it's sufficiently material to warrant a failed score. You can decide that it's material, but at this point it's not sufficient material to warrant a failed score.
May I quote this document on the first page under saying a responsive bid indicates compliance without material deviation. The word significant is not in there.
You're correct. It's not until the second page. And if that's a confusion, we apologize.
Thank you.
Mr. Claypool.
As we discussed yesterday, we put that process that Commissioner Yao is correctly quoting. And I believe that this commission, although you can, you're certainly entitled to deviate from these rules, if I hate to use the word deviate. But having said that, you should, I believe, and my advice would be, look at this as making a decision point by point. If you believe that this is a material deviation, then you should make that ruling and follow your process and not change your process. That would be important. If not, you should move through the process as you've agreed to yesterday.
So when you say determine if it's material deviation, you're saying not just a significant material deviation, you're saying if it's deemed material deviation, it's failed.
It would be an unresponsive bid.
The motion as phrased, though, is contrary to the process. So just as a reminder.
So I'm happy to amend my motion. It was amended the first time based on the feedback of Ms. Johnston, so we can go back. I believe the original motion was to recognize that the bidder's response to the conflict and impartiality statement as materially deviant from what we had requested.
And I'll second that.
Any further discussion from any commissioner?
I guess I need a translation.
I'm just going to speak as to the substance, not the process.
Anything further, Commissioner Yao? Otherwise, Commissioner Blanco?
Is it a material deviation? Is it not a material deviation?
My motion is that I am saying that yes, it is, and
Thank
that
you.
was what we will be voting on. If it is, you would vote yes. If it is not, you would vote no.
All right.
Commissioner Blanco.
I'm clear.
Commissioner Blanco.
Okay. My biggest concern here, and why I do believe this is a material deviation, I'm somewhat troubled by the disclosure on the failure to disclose Mr. Levitt, but I agree with Commissioner Ward that it is in the resume, and so it's there. I am concerned about the lack of attention to detail coming from somebody that's applying to be our technical expert on a very technical, detailed process, but the information's there. So I don't think that's would be sufficient for me. My concern on the funding, whether it was Rose Institute or whether it's the Claremont McKenna college, is that the section on page 31 notes that the Institute's operations are funded by a variety of sources. And this has been said before, but now there's a motion on the floor. It says that they're funded by endowment, research projects, donations from the Board of Governors, alumni, and it says none of these funding sources represent any conflict with the Institute's proposed work for the Commission. And then there is absolutely nothing to verify that statement in the materials. And so, to me, that is very problematic. That's tantamount to no disclosure at all, and in fact, it is saying, take my word for it, which to me is not in the spirit of the disclosure requirements that the regs envision for us and for everybody, but especially for important consultants. We were not allowed to say, take my word for it. I have no conflict. We had to submit financial forms, and they asked us about every single member of our family. I worked at an institute at the time that I could disaggregate the funds that came to my institute, even though I was part of the university, because it was also clustered in a university. So to me, the fact that the donations are stated and then there's no disclosure of what they are, but that just a blanket statement, is very troubling to me, because it shows that there was an understanding that the funds could potentially pose a conflict, and inclusionary just saying there's no conflict. And that's not the spirit of the regulations.
Commissioner Ryan.
I want to be sure I understand what I'm voting on. As I understand, the motion now is to find that this is a material deviation. Does that, in conjunction with that, is there like another half to that, a material deviation that disqualifies this bidder? Because that little sufficiently thing is still floating around out there, and that's very troublesome to me. So, I want to understand it to be a material deviation. That's what I'm speaking. Yes, but we have that language that says any deviation sufficiently material to warrant a failed score.
That's what I'm speaking in support of. That was my understanding of the motion on the floor.
Well, I would like the maker of the motion to confirm that, or possibly put that word in there if that's what you intend, that it is sufficiently material to warrant a failed score. Otherwise, I just feel I'm not sure what I'm voting on.
Commissioner Galamas-Malloy.
So my understanding was that if we were to vote as a commission that this was a material deviation, that following our process guidelines on the bid evaluation, that the next step would be failed. Is that correct? Based on the conversation here today. Or I would need to say, add sufficiently into my motion.
If you were to
include it in
it
your...
would certainly be clearer.
Okay. So with that, I will again amend my motion.
Revise.
It is important. It is very important. This is one of the most important decisions the Commission will make, and I appreciate all the clarification. So with that, my motion shall be that the bidder's response to the conflict and impartiality statement constitutes a sufficiently material deviation in order enough to warrant a failed score on the bidder's proposal.
And my second stands.
Any further discussion from any other commission member? Then the chair will take, Commissioner Forbes.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment why I support this motion. I think that, as I said earlier, the essence of this commission is transparency. And I think that's, as Commissioner Blanco said, our family was involved in our disclosures. And we see so much in today's politics where big money which we don't know where it comes from, is used to, I'll use the word manipulate, it's kind of a harsh word, but to make the system responsive to certain people, and we never know where that money comes from. There may be no conflict here, but we can't know that. And I do not want this commission to be faced with some investigative reporter 30 days down the road who investigates the board of directors of the Rose Institute and finds, oh my goodness, this person is giving this much money to XYZ things. I think that would do great damage to us and do great damage to the people of California.
Commissioner Ward?
I just don't disagree horribly with my my friend here, but it just seems to me like that's a next step argument to me off of this issue. Again, I shared I was equally troubled in the conflict of interest statement, but upon asking for clarification, that's where and having to take that and evaluate that as well. Again, with the personnel issues, we agreed that this was done in this proposal bid was put together in poor form. We've already agreed on that, and the information was in the resumes. So I don't see that as a omission or negative intent in there. So to me, it's as acceptable as prior decisions that were made. And then with his explanation and the statement in the document that says that a full list of donors would take longer than the time provided to complete the proposal. Understanding that donations are made, of course they are. I have no doubt about that. But in understanding the clarification that there might be rules and procedures and things in place that just simply wasn't available. And then with the clarification again, it does seem like the additional amended explanation to a statement on the form does acknowledge that donations are made, and then there's further information. Unfortunately, we have to hunt for it. But whether or not, again, I feel this is disqualifying at this point. Now, again, maybe later we can argue about the form of it, but if it's disqualifying, I have a problem with that at this point.
Commissioner Dye.
I'm struggling with this a little bit because I like the flexibility that we had there for a fleeting moment. But the public may recall that I was the one who pushed for a competitive bid. I thought that was important for the commission to have that opportunity to choose. And we've been, we're forced to use the rather onerous state contracting process, and I do think it's important that we follow these rules. As I stated before, my issue was kind of with the first statement. I appreciated Mr. Johnson's explanation on the staff. I think that Commissioner Ward's point is well taken, that the information is there, even if it wasn't stated. I do think that some of these things are kind of black and white, though. The question about staff conflicts asked for full disclosure. And it didn't say, has worked as a paid nonpartisan, that the conflict was with serving as partisan legislative staff. It just says legislative staff of any kind. You can argue whether that's valid or not, but that's what's in our code right now. So I do think that one, I have a little trouble with. I think, assembly fellow or not, I'm pretty sure that Mr. Levitt was paid and he worked for the legislature. So that, to me, was pretty clear. On the donations or funding, I appreciate that information was in a different place. I also appreciate that the bidders had very little time to put this together. I'm very sympathetic for that. However, it very clearly says to indicate cash or in-kind, even if it were annotated on the side in handwriting next to each of the projects. It just seems like there wasn't an effort to make this a complete response. And then again, like I said, there's this blanket statement that we need to take it on faith that there are no conflicts. And believe me, all of us know that certainly the Bureau of State Audits didn't take anything on faith. I mean, they called all of my references, they double-checked, they Google-checked us. I mean, they didn't take anything we said on faith. And I think we're in a very highly charged partisan environment right now. We've been told there's a lot of paranoia going on about what the commission might do. Like Commissioner Forbes, I think, what's important about this commission is the openness and transparency. And to me, I feel like this is really core to what we're doing. And I want to contrast this with the process that we did yesterday, where we had, two bidders with partisan ties that were very in gross detail disclosed, so that we could have the discussion. And my concern here is that there's just not enough information here to even have the discussion. We're asked to take it on faith, and I'm just not comfortable doing that. As much as I would have liked to have a little flexibility to look at the picture in totality, it doesn't seem like the process will allow us to do that. So.
Commissioner Giulia was next.
In looking at this, as my understanding is, we are basically asking whether or not the bidder is responsive to the questions that were asked. I'm determining whether the responsiveness was sufficiently material to be a deviation. And the way I look at it is the donations were not listed where they were asked to be listed in terms of providing us with a level of detail that we would have an ability at a later point to decide whether it was responsible. That is a deviation in my mind, a significant one because it wasn't there. In the areas of conflict, they were not the conflicts that are there at a later point. If you wanted to dig into the resumes, you might have been able to find them, which they were there, so they should have been listed. They were not listed. It was a material deviation because they were not responsive when the question was asked. One of the things that, in all the years I've had over 15 years worth of grant review in the public, private, nonprofit area, and also in bidders workshops, things to assist individuals when they were submitting their grants. And one of the things that's always difficult for those potential bidders is it's just such a daunting process. And one of the things I always tell them is just answer the question. You have to answer the question so that we have something to base it on. If the question is not answered, it is not responsive to what we have asked for. Therefore, in a later process, I wouldn't be able to even make a determination. But in this case, in my mind, this bid was not responsive, and it was sufficiently material to be. It was enough to be a sufficient material deviation for me.
Commissioner Yao.
Recall when we first moved up here to Sacramento, and after a month and a half, we found out staff couldn't even buy any Microsoft software for the computer that they received from the state of California. You have to work in a big corporation in order to recognize some of the built-in issues that are with bureaucracies. In the 80s, I worked for the biggest company in the state of California. At that point, it was called the Hughes Aircraft Company, largest employer in the whole state. And we encountered bureaucracies that we didn't understand, but eventually learned to, as a young engineer starting with the company, eventually learn how to work with it. And in this particular case, you're comparing a very small company, which we approved very early on, that dotted every I and crossed every T. And now you're looking at a fairly big institution, the Claremont Mechanic College. And if you basically evaluate it on the same criteria, then clearly you're going to find differences. And here we are trying to decide as to whether these type of differences is is going to be a disqualifying factor for a contractor. Now, I'm not trying to excuse the fact that it couldn't have been done better, it couldn't have been done differently, and I have not sensed any intent to deceive or trying to make it difficult for us to evaluate the proposal. And if we find as we comb through the details of the proposal, we found the data in there, and it suggests that there's been no attempt to disguise the data or to disguise this commission. And if we find this to be material inadequate,